empty streets, shuttered markets. Families unsure if food will last the weeks. Likes like a headline from recent years, doesn't it? Lockdowns, supply shortages, even the sense that the weather itself has turned against us. Now imagine all of that happening at once, and without the comfort of electricity, medicine, or global trade. That was Europe in the late Middle Ages. The Black Death tore through cities. Winters grew colder, harvests failed, and kingdoms drained their people to pay for endless wars. For those who lived then, every day carried the question we still ask in hard times. Will life ever return to normal? Tonight, we'll walk through that world together, past plague pits and marketplaces, frozen farms and battlefields, meeting kings and popes, but also the ordinary people who endured it all. So, find a comfortable place to rest, and let the story carry you back in time. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because sometimes history feels closer than we think. The year is 1300, and Europe seems to be bursting with life. The streets of Florence buzz with merchants tallying their ledgers. In Paris, the cathedral bells ring over a city swollen with scholars and traders. In London, barges carry wool down the Thames, feeding an industry that links England to the continent. Families are large, towns are growing, and the air hums with a sense of progress. But behind the energy of this crowded age lies a dangerous truth. Europe is already stretched to its limits. Centuries of steady population growth have filled every corner of arable land. The rich soils of river valleys are long claimed. Hillsides once left to forests are now carved into small, stubborn fields. Even the marshes and moors have been drained and planted. The medieval farmer has no more land left to push into dot at first. The signs of strain are subtle. Yields of grain dip ever so slightly. A bad harvest means lean months instead of abundance. Families who once had a little surplus find their granaries empty by spring. The balance between mouths to feed and food to supply grows thinner each year. Modern ears might hear this and think of supermarket shelves. Imagine every trip bringing home just a little less flour, a little less meat, a little less milk. The shelves don't look bare, but you notice your purse is lighter, your meals a little thinner. That is how the early 14th century felt. Life bustling as usual, but with a nagging weakness just beneath the surface. Then the climate turned. Historians call it the Little Ice Age, a long cooling period that began in the late 1200s. Winters grew harsher, summers shorter, rains more relentless. At first, people shrugged it off. A cold year here, a rainy season, their nature was always fickle. But then came the disaster of 1315. Rain poured across Europe for months. It fell in steady sheets, flattening crops, flooding rivers, drowning the grain before it could ripen. Livestock collapsed in the mud, fodder rotted in barns, and seed stores dwindled. Bread, the foundation of medieval life, became scarce. Families mixed acorns and ground peas into their dough, stretching what little they had. Even ale, usually a reliable comfort, was rationed as barley vanished into desperate bread ovens. King Edward II of England faced the crisis with all the helplessness of a monarch whose authority ended where the clouds began. He issued decrees to control prices, tried to import grain from abroad, even banned certain feasts to conserve supplies. None of it mattered. Wheat prices tripled. Meat and dairy disappeared from the markets. The chronicles of the time spare no horror. They tell of people boiling grass and weeds into thin, bitter soups, of mothers abandoning children at monastery doors, hoping for mercy, of travelers robbed, not for money, but for food. In some corners of Europe, there were whispers too dark to repeat, loud rumors of cannibalism, of corpses disappearing from churchyards. For the ordinary farmer, hunger was not a temporary discomfort. It was a constant shadow. To wake in the morning with an empty belly, to send children to bed crying with hunger that was the rhythm of daily life. And hunger weakened more than the body. It eroded trust, frayed communities, and made neighbors fear one another. By 1317, the rains finally eased, but the scars lingered. Whole villages had lost a third of their people. Herds of cattle were gone, seed stocks empty, and the rhythm of sowing and reaping felt permanently broken. Even as markets reopened and bread returned to the stalls, no one forgot how quickly abundance could vanish. And so, Europe entered the middle of the 14th century, not as a strong, thriving world, but as one already bruised, its resilience chipped away. People hoped the worst was over, but history, as always, was only just beginning. Recovery, when it came after 1317, arrived on quiet feet. Fields were tilled again, markets reopened, and the clatter of mills returned to riverbanks that had gone strangely silent. Yet the sound was thinner than before, like a bell with a hidden crack. You could buy bread again, but loaves were smaller. You could hire a plowman, but he tired sooner than he once did. Hunger had left fingerprints on every rib and every ledger. Families learned new habits of caution. Seed grain was guarded like treasure, and a pig fattened through the winter was spoken of with the same pride once reserved for a son's apprenticeship. Villages that had emptied began to refill, but not with the same people. Some households were held together by cousins and in-laws, others by widows who now managed farms, keeping accounts with neat, anxious lines of charcoal on scraps of wood. If you visit a modern supermarket at closing time and see the careful way people choose what's left, you would understand the mood of those years. The land itself had not forgiven. Good soils still yielded, but the marginal plots taken up in the boom years, steep hillsides, damp bottoms, thin pastures, demanded relentless labor for a meager reward. A spring frost could undo months of work. A sodden autumn could turn the harvest into a dark paste beneath boot heels. The word surplus became a memory, and with it the festivals that once brightened the calendar. Harvest still brought a dance, a jug of ale, a few reckless songs, but fewer candles were lit, and fewer chairs were needed. Kings felt the narrowing as surely as peasants. Edward II's clumsy price edicts during the famine had convinced many that royal writ could not conjure grain. His successor would inherit not just a crown, but a heavy silence whenever the court spoke of levies. Across the Channel, in France, and Flanders, rulers tugged the same frayed cord. Soldiers had to be paid, walls repaired, bridges mended, yet every tax collector knew to tread softly past barns with thin roofs and yards missing hens. Power is loud in prosperous times. In lean seasons, it must whisper. Towns tried to cushion the countryside's nerves. The Hanseatic merchants kept ships moving along the cold gray edges of the North and Baltic seas, bringing salt and fish, cloth and tools. In Bruges and Ghent, weavers bent over looms from dawn to dusk, their wages feeding bakeries that made the air smell reassuringly ordinary. Florence grew richer on banking and cloth, London on wool, Paris on everything. But urban life depended on the same fragile line of carts from the fields. A flooded road or a round of livestock disease could empty stalls by week's end. Shopkeepers became very good at counting and even better at apologizing. Priests and friars filled the spaces that anxiety opens. Processions wound through streets after a bad harvest, candles dripping wax onto cobblestones. Penitential psalms rose in stone naves that, for an hour or two, felt warmer than the weather deserved. The language was familiar misfortune as discipline, suffering as instruction. But something had shifted. A famine blamed on human sin could be endured, if behavior might change it. A climate that seemed to change of its own accord was harder to bargain with. Quiet doubts began to pool in the corners of confessionals. Not that life became all shadow, Children still chased each other around market wells. A carpenter in York finally saved enough to add a second room to his cottage. A midwife in a Norman village kept a tally of births that slowly, carefully climbed. A miller in the Rhineland let customers pay in flour instead of coin. When silver was scarce, his wife kept each family's flour debt. In a tidy bundle of string-tied notches, people improvised the way they always do, stitching little workarounds into the fabric of ordinary days. Health, though never quite recovered its color. Malnutrition had left bodies smaller and lungs more easily winded. Old illnesses returned, with sharper teeth, agues that lingered for weeks, coughs that chewed through a household, fevers that ran hot and then simply walked away with a child in the night. Monks copying infirmary rolls added more crosses than before. The living learned to read those lists as sailors read the weather, looking for patterns, hoping none appeared. Prices moved like birds startled into flight. Up here, down there, never quite settling. A good run of summers might bring a pleasant drop in the cost of rye. 2 wet weeks in August could erase the gain. Guilds tried to steady wages, town councils rationed grain in lean months, and rulers occasionally reopened the old chest of decrees about just prices. But markets are stubborn creatures. They listen politely to law, and then obey supply and demand. Households answered with prudence. A cloak patched instead of replaced. A wedding delayed until spring lambs proved the flock would grow. If you squint a little, you can see a familiar outline. A supply shock, a labor shortage, a nervous politics that tiptoes around empty cupboards. We think of our own times, disruptions, storms that stall ships offshore, a disease that closes street sand. We recognize the same small adjustments. Stretch the pantry, mend the shoes, check on the neighbor. The Middle Ages did not own hardship. They simply knew it well. Along trade routes, the world knit itself closer. Caravans threaded Anatolian passes. Venetian galleys swung in neat arcs across the Adriatic. Genoese factors counted bales and barrels, with enviable neatness. Each connection promised prosperity, and delivered it mostly. Yet every road is also a corridor, every harbor a door. The continent's new closeness felt like a blessing after the famine years. It would soon, for a time, feel like the opposite. By the late 1330s, a traveler could move from the steppe to the Channel, meeting brokers, pilgrims, mercenaries, spice sellers, all speaking enough of each other's tongues to bargain and bless. News moved with them, of a siege on a far coast, of a strange sickness in a city you'd never seen, of ships that docked with fewer men than they set sail with. Most rumors die at the tavern door. Some step inside and sit down. For now, the mills keep turning. The baker taps flour from his paddle and hums. A child runs a finger through the fog on a window and draws a clumsy sun. Across a narrow sea, a clerk sharpens his quill, tidies the pages of a ledger, and records the arrival of a ship whose cargo will be discussed for generations. If you're still listening comfortably, press 1 in the comments, it helps me. Paste the story for you. The 1330s arrived with a strange mixture of confidence and fragility. In many towns, people convinced themselves that the Great Famine had been a once-in-a-lifetime tragedy. Fields greened again, cattle herds slowly rebuilt, and children who had been born in the shadow of hunger were now old enough to work. But the deeper marks remained, even if daily life pretended otherwise. In the countryside, the soil had grown tired. Centuries of relentless cultivation left fields depleted, their yields lower each season. Without the modern knowledge of crop rotation or chemical fertilizers, medieval farmers fought decline with sheer effort. They dug deeper ditches, carried more manure, extended work hours until dawn blurred into dusk. Yet even their hardest labor only just kept famine at bay. A poor summer or a cold spring could undo everything. It was like living on the edge of a cliff, never knowing when the ground might crumble beneath your feet. The pressure showed in households. Marriage ages crept upward as young couples hesitated to start families they could not feed. Inheritance disputes multiplied when land was too small to divide fairly. Brothers quarreled, cousins drifted away. Villages split and reformed around whatever scraps of soil could still be claimed. Meanwhile, the cities hummed with their own tensions. Paris, Florence, and London grew larger, their skylines crowded. With spires and guild halls, the wealthiest citizens draped themselves in fine cloth, dined on imported spices, and spoke proudly of a Europe more connected than ever. But prosperity was not evenly shared. Behind the walls of workshops, apprentices toiled for pennies. In back alleys, widows sold stale bread, and day laborers lined up at dawn, hoping for a mason or merchant to hire them for a few coins. Rulers saw both the glitter and the fragility. Edward III in England, Philip VI in France, and the city councils of the Low Countries tried to harness growth without letting unrest boil over. Taxes were carefully balanced high enough to fund castles, courts, and wars, but not so high as to spark revolt. Yet the margin was thin, one levy too many, one failed harvest, and the crowd could turn on its masters. The church, still the great anchor of medieval life, struggled with its own contradictions. Cathedrals rose, sermons thundered, and pilgrimages carried thousands to shrines like Santiago de Compostela. But ordinary believers whispered their doubts. Why had God allowed the famine? Why had prayers not stopped the rains? When a child coughed through the night, or a harvest failed, despite every candle lit, faith faltered. Priests answered, with familiar lines about sin and penance. But the unease remained, and yet life still had its ordinary rhythms. Market squares bustled on feast days. Jugglers and musicians entertained crowds who desperately wanted to forget their troubles. Children played in the dust of narrow streets, their laughter echoing against timbered walls. A baker in Cologne still woke before dawn, kneading dough in the dim glow of his oven. A shepherd in Castile still guided his flock along the same rocky path his father had walked. People have always found ways to keep going, even when shadows lengthen. But shadows were indeed lengthening. Travelers along the great trade routes brought back strange stories. In Constantinople, a merchant reported a fever had broken out, killing many in a single week. In the ports of the Black Sea, sailors whispered of ships returning with too few crew, of rats scurrying off gangplanks in unusual numbers. Most Europeans dismissed such tales as the usual exaggerations of men who had seen too much wine and too many foreign shores. But some listened closely. Rumors have a way of lodging themselves in memory. The irony was cruel. The very networks that had made Europe wealthier and more vibrant were also the threads along which danger traveled. Caravans carried silks and spices, but also diseases. Ships bore wool, grain, and wine, but in their dark holds, fleas nestled in straw. A continent that had survived famine now leaned heavily on trade, for recovery at trade itself would open the door to the next catastrophe. Looking back, we can see the pattern clearly. A population weakened by years of hunger. Soil stretched to its limits. Cities crowded beyond their means. A church strained by doubt. A network of ships and caravans binding Europe to the wider world. All the ingredients were there, waiting for a spark, and that spark would not wait long. In 1346, far from the comfortable hearths of Paris or London, a siege on the distant Black Sea coast would fling the first sparks across the continent. Within a year, they would land in Sicily. Within another, they would sweep north to the great cities of Europe. The famine had been a warning. The true storm was about to break. If you're still with me, listening gently, press 1 in the comments. It helps me know you're still awake or, perhaps, drifting into sleep with history by your side. By the early 1340s, Europe walked a narrow ridge between hope and dread. On the surface, there were reasons to be optimistic. Harvests, though never abundant, had at least been steady for a few years. Cloth markets in Flanders buzzed with the hum of looms. Bankers in Florence recorded tidy profits, and England's wool trade fattened royal treasuries. Pilgrims once again crowded the roads to Canterbury, Santiago, and Rome, singing hymns as if the world had finally steadied. Yet beneath this fragile prosperity ran a current of unease. Everyone remembered the famine. People knew how quickly the skies could turn, how easily the grain could rot in the fields, how swiftly hunger could undo years of effort. That memory did not fade. It lived in every cautious glance at a cloudy horizon, in every mother who tucked away an extra loaf, in every village elder who warned the young that the land gives and takes as it pleases. The landscape itself showed scars of the earlier crisis. Abandoned villages dotted the countryside, their churches roofless, their wells dry. Travelers noted skeletons of houses standing empty, orchards untended, fields swallowed by weeds. These were silent reminders that, even in a season of growth, decline lurked close by. The nobility, too, carried its share of anxiety. Lords found it harder to demand traditional dues from peasants who had grown bolder since the famine. A serf could threaten to leave a manor entirely, and with so much land underworked, the lord might have no choice but to bargain. Wages for skilled laborers crept upward, to the irritation of guildmasters who preferred the stability of earlier times. Tensions simmered, though it had not yet boiled over. In towns, the contrast between rich and poor widened. Wealthy merchants built stone houses with glazed windows and filled them with tapestries from the East. Their daughters wore velvet, their sons studied Latin and law. But in the alleys outside, beggars huddled against church doors, apprentices shared straw mattresses in crowded attics, and widows tried to stretch a few coins through a bitter winter. The hum of prosperity was always accompanied by the low groan of poverty. The church sought to reassure a population restless with doubt. Priests preached repentance, friars urged charity, and bishops organized elaborate processions to demonstrate that the heavens still favored Christendom. Yet cracks showed. Complaints about simony and corruption grew louder. Some whispered that the famine had not been a punishment of the people, but a sign that their shepherds had failed. In Paris, scholars debated astrology and medicine as much as theology, hinting that explanations might one day come from stars and humors instead of scripture. Still, daily life continued in its ordinary rhythm. Bakers rose before dawn, their ovens glowing warm against the dark. Children played in the mud of village lanes, tossing sticks as if they were swords. Farmers cursed the rain or prayed for it, depending on the week. A mason chiseled stone. In York, a fisherman mended nets on the Breton coast. A midwife prepared herbs in a Dutch village. History has always lived in these quiet tasks, even when storms are gathering. And storms were gathering along the trade routes that connected Europe. To the wider world, troubling stories began to circulate. A merchant returning from the Black Sea told of a fever that struck without warning, killing within days. In Constantinople, sailors whispered of ships docking half-crewed, the rest of their men buried at sea. In Genoa and Venice, port officials noticed more vessels arriving with sick men stumbling off the gangplanks. Few in northern Europe paid much attention at first. After all, distant lands were always filled with strange illnesses and dramatic tales. A German proverb warned against believing too much of what a sailor says after wine. Yet a few listeners frowned, tucked the stories away in memory, and wondered. Looking back, we can see the irony clearly. Europe's recovery after famine had been built on the very networks that would soon betray it. Trade brought grain, salt, fish, wool, cloth, wine, spices. It brought coins and credit, opportunity and profit. But it also brought rats and fleas, and something far more terrible that traveled silently in their blood. The continent was like a patient who has survived one illness but never regained full strength. Malnutrition, poverty, and overwork had left bodies frail. Doubt had left spirits uneasy. Communities had rebuilt, but on fragile foundations. All it would take was one more blow sudden, swift, merciless, to turn unease into collapse, and in 1346, that blow would come. On the shores of the Black Sea, at a city called Kaffa, besieging armies would hurl corpses over the walls. Whether or not the tale is precisely true, what matters is that ships soon sailed westward. They carried grain, they carried cloth, and they carried death. Europe's fragile balance was about to shatter. If you're still listening, gently press 1 in the comments. It lets me know you're still here, following along even as the story tears. In the summer of 1346, the Crimean port of Kefon, the far edge of Europe's awareness, fell under siege. Genoese merchants had long traded there, ferrying grain and goods between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. But this time, the siege brought more than swords and arrows. Chronicles tell a chilling tale. When disease broke out in the Mongol army, the besiegers catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. Whether fact or rumor, the story traveled west with the ships that fled the harbor. What no one could deny was this: when the galleys set sail from Kaffa, they carried with them an invisible cargo that would soon unravel Europe. The sailors themselves were the first signs. By the time their ships touched ports in Messina, Genoa, and Venice, men stumbled ashore with fevers raging and swellings like black tumors under their arms and in their groins. They coughed blood, collapsed in the streets, and died within days. Rats skittered off the ships, carrying fleas that held the real killer, a bacterium Europe had never faced before. One that leaped from animal to human with terrifying ease. At first, towns reacted as they always did to illness, with prayers, with quarantines, with a little denial. Sicilian officials ordered the Genoese galleys out of Messina's harbor, hoping that would contain the sickness. But the disease moved faster than fear could chase it. Sailors who slipped ashore carried it to marketplaces, to taverns, to churches. Within weeks, bodies piled in streets, and the bells of Messina tolled without pause. From Sicily, the plague rode the trade routes north. Ships carried it to Marseille, Barcelona, and Valencia. Caravans brought it inland to Avignon, where even the Pope huddled behind walls draped with smoking herbs, believing the fumes might purify the air. In every city it touched, life collapsed in days. And yet, in 1347, most of Europe still lived, as if the old rhythms would continue. A baker in Paris kneaded dough in his dark shop, whistling to himself as he had for years. A farmer in Kent sowed autumn wheat, already thinking of spring. A merchant in Bruges counted profits from wool and cloth, planning to send his son to Italy for business. None of them could imagine that, within a few short years, half their world might be gone. The irony is painful to us, who know what came next. But to them, the late 1340s were still a time of cautious hope. Children born after the famine now filled streets with laughter. Priests still rang bells for weddings and feast days, not just for funerals. Kings plotted wars, nobles schemed marriages, merchants dreamed of profits. Europe looked ahead, never suspecting how short its horizon had become. And that is where we leave Chapter 1. A continent that had already endured famine and doubt, patched itself back together, and believed it had found stability again. But across the sea, invisible passengers waited in the straw of shipholds, clinging to the backs of rats. They would disembark soon enough, and when they did, no village, no city, no king, and no peasant would escape their shadow. The storm was almost at the door. If you're still with me, leave a 1 in the comments. It lets me know you followed this far through the quiet before the plague. The ships came quietly. In late 1347, galleys from the Black Sea slipped into Mediterranean harbors, as they always had, their sails patched, their holds heavy with grain, wine, and cloth. Dock workers, used to the rough talk of sailors, thought little of the men who staggered down the gangplanks, coughing and pale. A fever here, a swollen lump. Their sailors were always sick after long voyages. But within days, it became clear this was no ordinary illness. In Messina, the bells began to toll. Families dragged carts of the dead to hurriedly dug pits. Priests who leaned close to give last rites fell ill themselves within the week. Neighbors shuttered their doors, and silence crept through the streets, broken only by the rattle of wheels, carrying corpses away. The city council tried to expel the Genoese galleys, but the damage was already done. Rats had scurried off the ships, fleas clinging to their fur, slipping into warehouses and taverns, weaving the plague into the fabric of the town. From Sicily the contagion leaped, as if carried on the very salt wind. It struck Marseille, then leaped to Barcelona, then Genoa. Venetian officials tried their best. They ordered ships quarantined on an offshore island, a practice that would give us the very word quarantine from 40 giorni, 40 days. But 40 days was far too short for a disease that struck like lightning. The plague had no patience for human rules. It swept into the lagoons of Venice, and from there, into the arteries of Europe. Those who saw it arrive described terror in language that still feels raw centuries later. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio recorded how neighbors abandoned neighbors. Fathers left children, husbands left wives. Whole families locked themselves in their houses to avoid infection, only to perish together. In London, chroniclers wrote of pits so full of bodies that earth could hardly cover them. In Avignon, where the Pope sheltered, carts dumped the dead into the Rhine River because there was no ground left for burials. The symptoms were unmistakable. Painful swellings, buboes rose in the groin and armpits, black and swollen. Fever burned through the body, delirium clouded the mind, and within days came death. Some bled from the nose and mouth, others collapsed without warning. It spared no rank. Nobles, priests, merchants, peasants all fell alike. Markets collapsed. Bakers stopped baking. Butchers stopped slaughtering. Merchants closed their stalls. Who would trade coin for bread when touching the wrong hand could be a death sentence? Gold and silver lost their meaning when no amount could bribe the plague to pass by a door. Fear twisted communities. Some clung more tightly to the church, filling cathedrals with prayers and incense, begging God to relent. Others turned on scapegoats. In towns along the Rhine, rumors accused Jewish communities of poisoning wells, and massacres followed. Desperation, bred cruelty, and centuries-old prejudices burst into violence under the weight of fear. And yet, even in this darkness, life continued in strange, stubborn ways. Children played in courtyards between outbreaks. A farmer still rose to tend sheep, not knowing if he would live to shear them. Lovers married in haste, hoping to taste joy before the sickness came. Monks in remote cloisters copied their manuscripts, unaware that the world outside was unraveling. Humanity has always clung to its rituals, even when death sits at the threshold. By 1349, the plague had swept into northern Europe. Paris lost perhaps half its people. London emptied so fast that fields outside the city sprouted makeshift cemeteries. In Norway, ships drifted into fjords, with every crewman dead, their sails flapping like ghostly shrouds. Iceland, too remote for armies or kings, was not too remote for rats. Even there, the plague came. It is hard to capture the scale of loss. Estimates vary. but perhaps 1 in every 2 Europeans died between 1347 and 1351. Half of every village, gone. Half of every family, gone. The famine had been cruel, but the plague was merciless. Where hunger had thinned bodies, plague erased them. Imagine standing in your own town, counting neighbors: 1, 2, gone. 3, 4, gone. Imagine streets so empty that grass pushes through the cobblestones. Imagine silence so heavy it feels like the world itself has ended. That was Europe in the Black Death. And yet, this was only the beginning. For in the aftermath of plague came something no one expected. A new balance of power, a new value for labor, and new cracks in the old order. But while the sickness raged, survival was the only thought. If you're still here with me, listening in the quiet, press 1 in the comments. It helps me know you're following through, even as the plague descends. By 1348, the Black Death was no longer a rumor from southern ports. It was a presence in nearly every city of Europe. The speed was shocking. One chronicler in Florence wrote that what began in the morning was ended by nightfall, describing neighbors who greeted each other at dawn and were dead by dusk. Entire streets fell silent. The living moved quickly past shuttered houses, pretending not to hear the cries inside. For ordinary people, daily life became a strange mixture of routine and terror. The baker still rose at dawn to light his oven, but few customers came, and fewer still returned twice. Markets stayed open, but buyers carried a fear that every coin exchanged might carry death. Priests continued to say Mass, though sometimes the service ended with the celebrant collapsing at the altar. Gravediggers, once invisible workers at the edge of society, became central figures, digging pits day and night, sometimes too hurried, to bless the ground. In Paris, the university doctors issued long explanations. Foul air rising from earthquakes, poisoned vapors from the east, even the alignment of the planets. Their prescriptions ranged from carrying herbs to avoiding baths, as hot water was thought to open the pores to deadly air. People clutched posies of lavender or rosemary, hoping the fragrance would repel the sickness. Some wore amulets or charms. Others relied on prayer. None of it worked. In England, King Edward III issued orders for streets to be cleaned and filth removed, believing cleanliness might banish the plague. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI sat between 2 blazing fires, convinced the heat would purify the air around him. He survived, whether by luck or by the accident of fire's warmth, keeping fleas at bay. No one knew, but not all responses were so measured. The flagellant bands of men who marched from town to town whipping their own backs bloody claimed that only through suffering could humanity win God's mercy. Crowds gathered to watch them, half in awe, half in fear. Authorities soon tried to suppress them, worried that their spectacle stirred unrest more than faith. Communities turned on outsiders. In German towns along the Rhine, Jewish neighborhoods were accused of poisoning wells, a fantasy born of desperation. Pogroms followed fires lit, families slaughtered, tragic violence layered on top of natural disaster. In Strasbourg alone, hundreds of Jews were burned alive in 1349, while the plague raged outside the city walls. And yet, even in the midst of this devastation, people clung to fragments of joy. Weddings were held in haste, as lovers chose not to wait. Children played in alleys when fear slackened. Merchants struck quick bargains, convinced tomorrow might not come. The very fragility of life pushed some to live more urgently, to drink, feast, or dance, even as death carts rolled by. Boccaccio, wandering Florence, captured this paradox. In his Decameron, he imagined young men and women fleeing the city to a villa in the countryside, telling each other stories to pass the time until the plague subsided. His fiction was born from grim reality, the instinct to escape, to distract, to create a bubble of laughter amid ruin. Villages fared no better than cities. In the English countryside, whole hamlets vanished. Plow teams went idle, fields lay fallow, and herds wandered without keepers. In some places, survivors returned months later to find houses collapsed, doors swinging open, weeds choking the hearths. Archaeologists still find these deserted villages ghost settlements, silent witnesses to the plague's passage. The mortality was staggering. France may have lost half its population, England perhaps a third, Germany something similar. Norway's coastlines were lined with ships drifting aimlessly, their crews dead. Even the remote valleys of Switzerland and the isolated farms of Scotland did not escape. No mountain was high enough, no forest deep enough, no monastery secluded enough. The plague found its way everywhere, and yet survival created new questions. When half the laborers in a village were gone, what did that mean for the survivors? Fields still needed to be tilled, but hands were scarce. For the first time in memory, peasants began to realize their work had new value. A living plowman could demand better wages, or even freedom from certain obligations. Lords who refused risked watching their fields lie empty. The world was shifting, though no one yet had the energy to notice. For now, the survivors staggered forward, dazed, surrounded by absence. The question was no longer how to live well, but simply how to endure until tomorrow. And tomorrow always came, but it arrived with fewer voices, emptier streets, and bells that tolled with a hollow echo. If you're still here, let me know with a gentle one in the comments. It tells me you're with me, even as we walk through the silence of plague-struck Europe by 1349. The plague had reached its terrible crescendo. Across Europe, whole communities seemed to vanish in a single season. In London, chroniclers wrote of pits so vast that a man could stand waist-deep among the corpses before the first shovelful of earth was thrown. In Paris, carts rattled ceaselessly over cobblestones, piled with the dead, their wheels leaving tracks darker than mud. The chronicler Jean de Venette, a Carmelite friar, observed the strangeness of it all. Nobles and peasants alike perished, the disease making no distinction of birth or rank. Daily life, such as it was, unfolded in fragments. A brewer in Ghent tried to keep his vats filled, but his apprentices were gone, and his customers too sick to drink. A mason in York sharpened his chisel one morning, only to lay it down forever by nightfall. A Parisian mother, widowed by the plague, carried her children to relatives outside the city, praying they would not be turned away. The streets themselves grew alien shops, shuttered, squares empty, silence replacing the clamor of trade. Even the cats and dogs seemed fewer, scavenging among the refuse of a dying town. Governments struggled to respond. King Edward III of England issued decrees against excessive wages, fearing that the scarcity of labor would allow peasants to demand more than their proper station permitted. In France, Philip VI sought to keep order through proclamations, but proclamations could not bury the dead or heal the sick. Civic councils tried quarantine measures, locking whole households inside when a single member fell ill. But often this only guaranteed that all inside would perish together. The church, long the anchor of medieval life, was shaken to its core. Priests and friars, who tended the dying with bravery, died in staggering numbers. Monasteries fell silent as entire communities of monks were wiped out. Faith endured, but confidence in the institution faltered. Some believers turned toward mysticism, convinced that visions and miracles offered answers more immediate than distant bishops. Others hardened into doubt, quietly wondering why prayers had not stayed the hand of death. The plague also unsettled Europe's social fabric in ways no one could ignore. In the German states, the massacres of Jewish communities continued with horrific intensity, scapegoats for a calamity they could not have caused. In Strasbourg, on Valentine's Day of 1349, Some 2,000 Jews were burned alive while the plague raged outside the city walls. Violence did not stop the disease, but desperation demanded victims, and prejudice supplied them. And yet, paradoxically, the very scale of mortality began to reveal opportunities. Where one family had perished, another might take over their land. A peasant who survived in a village where half the households were gone suddenly found his labor precious. Fields still needed to be plowed, rents still demanded, but there were fewer hands to do the work. Survivors discovered bargaining power they had never known. Lords who once commanded obedience now had to entice workers with better terms. Meanwhile, the survivors carried grief as heavy as their newfound leverage. In Florence, Boccaccio wrote that the brother abandoned the brother. The uncle, the nephew, the sister, the brother, and oftentimes the wife, her husband. But he also noted small acts of resilience. Friends forming makeshift households, neighbors pooling food, young people gathering in gardens to tell stories, as if laughter could keep the shadow at bay. The human instinct to cling to life proved as stubborn as the disease was merciless. By 1350, the plague had swept into the northern reaches of Europe. In Scandinavia, it rolled along the fjords, leaving farms abandoned. In Norway, ships drifted aimlessly into harbors, their crews long dead, sails flapping like ghostly shrouds. Even Iceland, distant and windswept, was not beyond its reach. To the east, the great cities of Poland and Bohemia braced themselves, though by strange accident or perhaps careful quarantines. Some escaped the worst. When the worst of the storm passed in 1351, Europe looked around and scarcely recognized itself. Whole dioceses were without clergy. Castles stood with their gates open, their lords gone. Entire villages were deserted, reclaimed by forest and field. And yet, in the silence that followed, something new stirred. Wages rising, rents lowered. Survivors inheriting lands and shops. Out of grief, a new balance was beginning to form. The Black Death had not ended Europe, but it had ended the Europe that was. If you're still listening, press 1 in the comments. It tells me you're walking with me through these dark years, step by step. Even as the bells toll in the distance. When the plague loosened its grip, it left more than empty houses and silent fields. It left wounds on the mind and spirit of Europe. Survival was not the same as healing. People emerged from their shuttered homes into streets half filled with weeds and memories, blinking into a world that no longer felt secure. What they carried was not just grief, but questions. For centuries, the church had been the anchor of meaning. Famine, drought, even war could be folded into sermons as divine punishment or divine test. But the Black Death was different. Priests had prayed. Processions had circled the streets. Relics had been displayed with solemn reverence. And yet the bells tolled ceaselessly for the dead. Entire monasteries vanished. Parish priests collapsed beside their flock. If the shepherds had fallen, what did that say about the flock? Faith did not disappear, but it fractured. Some believers doubled down, convinced that only harsher piety could appease God. They fasted, scourged themselves, and joined penitential movements like the Flagellants, whose grim processions unsettled even the authorities. Others turned to mysticism, visions, dreams, private revelations, as if divine answers had slipped out of reach of bishops and into the hearts of the desperate. There were also quiet skeptics. In university towns, scholars whispered that perhaps disease had causes in nature rather than sin. The physicians of Paris wrote learned treatises on the corruption of air and the influence of planets. Wrong though their theories were, they represented a subtle shift, an attempt to explain disaster without leaning only on scripture. Seeds of new thinking had been planted, even if centuries would pass before they bloomed fully. Art and literature absorbed the trauma. Churches commissioned frescoes of skeletons, leading nobles and peasants alike in the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. Manuscripts were illuminated with images of coffins, worms, and grim reapers, reminders that death was no respecter of rank. Morality plays, staged in town squares, warned that vanity and wealth crumbled before the grave. Even lullabies carried darker tones, sung softly to children who might not see another spring. Ordinary people found their own ways of coping. Some carried charms of saintly relics. Others clutched posies of herbs, even after the worst had passed, as if fragrance alone could keep away the memory. Many told stories of whole villages hidden from the plague by angelic protection, of miraculous cures whispered in dreams, of strangers in cloaks passing through towns to bless or curse. Folklore, thickened like a protective quilt, part comfort, part explanation. But not all responses were pious or restrained. In taverns, survivors drank heavily, saying that if life was uncertain, one might as well live it quickly. Lawsuits over inheritances multiplied, as families squabbled over lands abandoned by the dead, the young, suddenly without elders to guide them, married swiftly and took over farms and shops, reshaping communities almost overnight. The social hierarchy felt less immovable when half of its rungs had been cut away. Communities also carried guilt. Survivors spoke of neighbors they had abandoned, of relatives they had locked outside their doors. Boccaccio noted with sorrow how the bonds of family had frayed under fear. After the plague, people remembered those choices. Some sought confession and absolution. Others buried their shame in silence. Trauma is not just the weight of loss, but the echo of decisions made when survival seemed the only law. The papacy itself revealed the fracture. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI granted sweeping indulgences to the dying, declaring that confession was not necessary if no priest could be found. It was practical, even merciful, but it also admitted that the old structures had failed. When Rome eventually reclaimed the papal seat, it did so with diminished prestige, as many remembered. Avignon, as a court besieged by plague, its prayers no stronger than those of common folk. And through all of this, the shadow of death lingered in imagination. Children who grew up in those years remembered silence where laughter should have been, empty chairs at every feast, fields lying fallow beside overgrown graveyards. They carried those memories into adulthood, shaping a culture more aware of fragility, more inclined to fatalism, but also more daring in its grasp of life. The Black Death was not just a biological event. It was a spiritual and psychological earthquake. It shook confidence in authority, carved fear into art and ritual, and whispered constantly that nothing on earth was secure. Yet even amid these shadows, new patterns were forming, patterns of thought, of labor, of wealth that would remake Europe. The plague had scoured the land, but in its wake, space opened for something different to grow. If you're still here, listening quietly, press 1 in the comments. It helps me know you're walking with me through not just the deaths, but the echoes they left behind. By the early 1350s, the plague's roar had finally quieted, but the world it left behind was not the same one that had greeted it. Fields lay fallow, workshops stood idle, and in many towns grass pushed through cobblestones where merchants once cried their wares. Europe had not ended, but it had been remade, its population halved, its habits unsettled, its balance of power trembling on new foundations. The most immediate change was in labor. Where once there had been too many mouths for too little land, now there was land everywhere and too few hands to work it. Survivors found themselves in an unfamiliar position. Wanted, a plowman who had once been bound to a manor could suddenly demand wages to match his worth. If a lord refused, he could walk to the next estate, or even to the nearest town, where guilds begged for apprentices and artisans to fill empty workshops. A mason in London, once overlooked among hundreds, name his price to rebuild the walls and homes the city needed. Kings and councils noticed. In England, Edward III issued the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, commanding that no worker should demand more than pre-plague wages. The law was an attempt to freeze the old order in place, but it failed. How could parchment and wax undo the reality of empty villages and neglected fields? Workers slipped away in the night, lords grumbled, and the market moved on without the king's blessing. Across Europe, similar decrees were issued and ignored. The great machinery of feudalism had been thrown off balance. Land, once precious, became oddly abundant. A peasant family that survived might find themselves inheriting not just their plot, but also the neighbors, and the neighbors' neighbors. Abandoned farms were folded into surviving households. With more land came better harvests for fewer mouths, and diets slowly improved. Meat and dairy, once scarce, became more common on humble tables. A new sense of possibility stirred, even as grief still lingered in the empty chairs around those tables. The urban world also shifted. Guilds, short of skilled hands, admitted new members more readily. Apprenticeships shortened, widows stepped into their husbands' trades, and younger sons who might once have been shut out found opportunity. Markets reopened, thinner but hungrier, and merchants who endured the plague often grew wealthier in its wake. Fortunes shifted quickly, families rose and fell, and social mobility edged upward in ways unthinkable a generation before. The church, though shaken, adjusted. With so many clergy dead, new priests were ordained in haste, some barely trained. Standards slipped, and complaints grew louder about corruption and incompetence. But the institution endured, offering ritual and comfort to survivors who still sought meaning. At the same time, lay movements, confraternities, charitable brotherhoods, even informal prayer groups multiplied, as ordinary people took more responsibility for their own spiritual lives. Authority had bent, and it would never quite straighten. Again, the psychological toll remained heavy. Survivors spoke of villages where dogs and cats roamed freely through deserted houses, of orchards heavy with fruit that no one came to pick. Children who grew up in these landscapes carried the memory of absence, shaping a generation wary of the fragility of life. Some responded with piety, some with indulgence, many with a quiet resolve to seize whatever days remained. In art and literature, the reminder of death never receded. The danse macabre spread across Europe, skeletons leading kings, merchants, maidens, and monks in a grim procession, reminding all that death spared no rank. Writers echoed the theme, crafting sermons and tales where pride, wealth, and power dissolved before the grave. Yet the very fixation on death betrayed a paradox. To think so much about endings was also to sharpen one's appetite for living. And through it all, the murmur of politics continued. Kings still schemed, nobles still quarreled, and borders still shifted. In fact, as the plague's shadow lifted, an old conflict re-emerged with redoubled force. The war between England and France, the 100 Years' War, paused briefly by pestilence, now returned with fire and steel. Soldiers, hungry for plunder, marched again across a landscape still littered with plague pits. Europe had survived one horseman of the apocalypse, only to see another ride forth. By 1351, the Black Death's first wave had passed, but it had left Europe permanently altered. Labor had gained power, feudalism had cracked, faith had splintered, and the very rhythm of life had shifted. The famine had taught Europe it was vulnerable. The plague had taught Europe it could be broken. The wars that followed would test whether it could be rebuilt. If you're still here, gently press 1 in the comments. It lets me know you've stayed through the silence of the plague and are ready to march with me into the noise of war. When the bells finally quieted and the plague's shadow thinned, Europe had little time to breathe. No sooner had the pits been filled and the prayers said than the rumble of armies returned. The horsemen of pestilence yielded the stage, and the horsemen of war rode back in. The long conflict between England and France, what we call the 100 Years' War, had begun even before the plague struck. Rival claims to the French throne, fueled by ambition and wounded pride, had already led to clashes. The pestilence briefly slowed the fighting, but it had not resolved the quarrel, and as survivors returned to their villages and towns, they found not peace, but soldiers. In 1346, just before the plague reached Europe, the English king Edward III had won a stunning victory at the Battle of Crecy. His long bowmen, standing in muddy fields, cut down waves of French knights, shattering the old code of chivalry with each arrow. It was a battle that marked a turning point. Honor and lineage mattered less when a peasant with a bow could fell a nobleman in armor. And though the plague soon swept across the continent, the memory of Crecy lingered, a grim reminder that the old order of war was changing. By 1356. With the worst of the Black Death past, war returned in full force. At Poitiers the English struck again, led by Edward's son, known to history as the Black Prince. French knights charged bravely, but the longbows cut them down, as at Crecy. King John II of France himself was captured, dragged from the battlefield. In humiliation, France staggered under the blow, its king in English custody, its fields ravaged, its people still weak from plague. For ordinary men and women, this was disaster piled upon disaster. Imagine being a peasant in northern France. You survived the famine of your childhood, endured the plague in your youth, only to see armies trample your fields and burn your home. Chroniclers tell of villages stripped bare by marauding soldiers, grain stolen, livestock driven off, cottages torched. Soldiers called it chivokey, the scorched earth raids that left nothing but ashes behind. To the generals, it was strategy. To the farmer, it was starvation. Even in England, where victories brought pride, the burdens were heavy. Taxes rose to fund campaigns across the Channel. Parliament debated subsidies, while common folk grumbled that they paid in coin and blood. For distant quarrels, war, like plague, did not distinguish much between guilty and innocent. It simply consumed. Yet the war also revealed the shifting balance of a post-plague world. With fewer peasants bound to the soil, lords found it harder to raise the old feudal. Levies' armies began to rely more on paid soldiers, mercenaries, who fought for coin rather than obligation. Men who once tilled fields now carried pikes and swords, earning wages on the battlefield. Violence became a profession, and professional soldiers became a roaming danger when wars paused. Disbanded mercenaries often turned to banditry, living off the countryside they had once fought to protect on towns. The war fed unease. Merchants feared ruined trade routes, artisans worried about shortages of materials, and all dreaded the arrival of troops, whether friend or foe. In Paris, chroniclers described citizens arming themselves to patrol the streets at night, not just against enemies beyond the walls, but against desperate men within them. And yet, amid the smoke and steel, life tried to carry on. Markets still opened in safer towns, though stalls were fewer and prices higher. Children played at games of knights and archers, imitating battles they barely understood, but saw etched into the faces of their parents. A merchant's wife in Rouen still recorded household expenses in careful script, even as she noted the loss of hens to soldiers in the margins. The Black Death had shown Europe how fragile life could be. The 100 Years' War showed how easily that fragility could be exploited. Every raid, every siege, every burned field was a reminder that recovery was never guaranteed. The continent had barely staggered back to its feet, only to be struck again, and yet people endured. They planted, rebuilt, married, bore children. They prayed for peace, even as kings sharpened swords. The story of the late Middle Ages is not simply one of suffering, but of resilience. But resilience has its limits, and with each campaign, those limits were tested. For now, the clash of banners replaced the tolling of bells. But the weight on Europe's shoulders only grew heavier. If you're still with me through the march of soldiers, press 1 in the comments. It helps me know you're walking with me as war replaces plague. For peasants and townsfolk, the return of war after the plague felt like a cruel joke. Having endured famine, then sickness, they now faced the tramp of boots and the crackle of flames. The chronicles of France and Flanders are filled with laments of villages stripped bare by passing troops. Armies, whether English or French, fed themselves not by supply lines but by seizing what they wanted. A chevauchée, a deliberate raid into enemy territory, meant fields trampled, barns emptied, and homes reduced to ashdod to commanders. This was strategy. To the villagers who had just buried half their kin from plague, it was survival shattered once again. A woman in Champagne wrote bitterly that the soldiers ate our bread, drank our wine, carried off our cattle, and left us only tears. Such voices rarely made it into official accounts, but they speak volumes about the real cost of war. Mercenaries' companies of soldiers for hire were another scourge. Lords found it easier to hire men with pikes and crossbows than to summon reluctant peasants. But mercenaries were loyal only to coin. When campaigns ended, they did not simply vanish. They roamed, extorting villages for protection money, or setting up as bandits along the roads. To live near a highway in the 1350s was to hear tales of caravans ambushed, farmhouses robbed, and travelers stripped of everything down to their boots. The line between war and crime blurred. Chroniclers described towns arming themselves, building palisades, even digging ditches around markets. Some communities struck deals with the bands, paying them a regular fee to pass them by. Others resisted and suffered the consequences. It was not only plague pits that dotted the landscape. Burned out cottages, toppled mills, and ruined harvests testified to war's reach. The nobility, weakened by plague losses, leaned harder on survivors to pay taxes and dues. But peasants, emboldened by their newfound scarcity, began to resist. Why should they pay the same when their labor was worth more? Why should they rebuild manors that had left them to starve? These tensions simmered until they boiled over in 1358. Northern France erupted in the Jacquerie, one of the most famous peasant uprisings of the Middle Ages. Exhausted by war, crushed by taxation, and enraged by noble arrogance, peasants in the Ile-de-France took up whatever weapons they could find: scythes, pitchforks, axes. They stormed manor houses, burning estates, and killing lords who had long demanded their obedience. The revolt spread rapidly, terrifying the nobility who suddenly found their serfs no longer meek but murderous. For a brief moment, it seemed the world had turned upside down. Castles, once symbols of invincibility, went up in flames. Aristocratic families fled in panic. Chroniclers, often writing from the perspective of the elite, described the peasants as beasts. Like mad dogs, their rage uncontrollable. But beneath the fear and exaggeration lay a truth. Ordinary people were no longer willing to suffer silently. The rebellion was crushed within months. Noble forces rallied, slaughtering thousands of peasants in retaliation. The social order reasserted itself. Lords still ruled. Peasants still bent their backs to the soil. But something had changed. Fear now ran in both directions. The nobility remembered the sight of peasants storming their halls, and peasants remembered the blood they had spilled. The seed of defiance had been planted. England, too, would eventually feel the spark in 1381, with the peasants' revolt. But in the 1350s, the Jacquerie was already a warning. War and plague together had pushed society to its breaking point. Amid this unrest, the everyday life of townsfolk continued, though tinged with anxiety. In Paris, markets reopened after each wave of turmoil, with vendors calling out over baskets of bread and barrels of wine. But customers looked nervously over their shoulders, knowing that soldiers might soon return. In London, merchants haggled for wool and cloth, even as Parliament debated fresh taxes to finance campaigns in France. Life went on, but always under a shadow, and across Europe, families adjusted to a grim rhythm: rebuild after famine, bury after plague, flee after raids. Children born in these years grew up in a world where disaster was normal, where stability was an illusion. The plague had shown them that death could come unseen, swift and merciless. War showed them that death could come loudly, with banners, trumpets, and fire. And between the two, people began to wonder if there was any ground safe enough to stand on. If you're still listening, press 1 in the comments. It helps me. Know you're walking with me, step by step, through famine, plague, and now the roar of war. War in the mid-14th century did not look quite like the chivalric tales sung in the great halls. The Black Death had not only thinned Europe's population, it had also changed the way battles were fought, and the way power was measured. The English longbow became a symbol of this shift. At the battles of Crécy, Saint-Malo, and Poitiers, Saint-Sambay-Wuchelot, ranks of English archers, ordinary men, not nobles, shattered the charge of French knights. Arrows fell in clouds, piercing armor, felling horses, and breaking the pride of men who had believed their lineage, and steel made them untouchable. A knight who had trained since childhood, invested in armor, horse, and retinue, could be undone in moments by a peasant with a U-boat. This was more than a battlefield lesson. It was a crack in the very foundation of feudal society. Chivalry had promised that nobility and valor determined victory. The battlefield now showed that discipline, technology, and numbers mattered more. It was an uncomfortable truth for those who claimed their right to rule through bloodlines. At the same time, armies themselves were changing. With so many peasants dead or unwilling to serve, lords relied increasingly on paid soldiers, mercenaries, who sold their swords to the highest bidder. These menaterms, drawn from across Europe, gave warfare a new professional edge. They fought fiercely, but loyalty was measured in coin, not oaths. When their wages stopped, they plundered the countryside, forming free companies that terrorized villages between campaigns. The presence of these mercenaries blurred the old lines between wartime and peacetime. A castle might fall in war, but a village could be stripped bare in peace by soldiers who simply decided they needed provisions. Chroniclers describe the same towns being pillaged 3 times in a year, first by the French army, then by the English, then by mercenaries who belonged to neither. For the common folk, banners mattered little. A soldier with a torch was a soldier with a torch, no matter whose colors he wore. These changes also affected the nobility itself. The death toll from the plague had thinned their ranks, and war thinned them further. Some great families vanished entirely, their lines broken. Others found themselves selling lands to pay ransoms after capture. The once sturdy walls of aristocratic privilege were cracking. A knight could die like any man in the plague years. Now on the battlefield, he could fall like any man too. For peasants, the chaos carried opportunity as well as danger. With land abundant and lords weakened, some serfs negotiated better terms or simply walked away. The war economy needed food, horses, and equipment, and those who could provide them found new leverage. In England, complaints of rising wages were so persistent that Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, 1351, to freeze pay at pre-plague levels. But laws written on parchment could not stop hunger in the bellies of landowners. Fields needed workers, and workers demanded their price. Meanwhile, the ideals of knightly honor looked increasingly hollow. At Poitiers, the French King John II was captured, dragged to London, and held for ransom. The humiliation echoed across Europe. A king, the very embodiment of feudal majesty, reduced to a bargaining chip. His captivity was proof that crowns and crests offered no immunity from the hard arithmetic of war. In taverns and villages, people noticed, if a peasant could kill a knight, if a king could be chained, then what did that say about the hierarchy that claimed divine sanction? Most still accepted their lot. Of course, centuries of tradition are not undone overnight, but doubt seeped in. Respect for nobility grew thinner. Deference, once automatic, became edged with resentment. And yet, for all the horror, war also created its own rhythms of normalcy. A village might burn one season and be rebuilt the next. Markets might empty when soldiers passed through, then reopen cautiously weeks later. Life folded itself around conflict, adjusting as people always do. A child born in 1349, in the depths of the plague, grew up by the 1360s, knowing nothing but a Europe of shifting banners and uncertain loyalties. For him or her, war was not disruption, it was the background hum of life. The Black Death had shown Europe that death could strike invisibly, without warning. The 100 Years' War showed that death could arrive openly, in mailed fists and flying banners, and that power itself was far less stable than it seemed. Chivalry was dying, and with it the unquestioned authority of those who wore crowns and coats of arms. But new storms were gathering, for war did not just strain peasants and nobles, it strained kings, treasuries, and even the church. And when institutions strain too far, they begin to break. If you're still walking with me through this march of armies, press 1 in the comments. It helps me know you're here, step by step. As the battlefield rewrites Europe's order, for those who are neither kings nor knights, but simply villagers, craftsmen, and traders, the war was not banners and glory, it was hunger, fear, and exhaustion. The chronicles record grand battles and noble deeds, but the lived reality was the steady grind of insecurity. A life punctuated by the sudden arrival of soldiers at the gate. Imagine being a farmer in Normandy. In the 1360s, your fields have just begun to recover from the losses of the plague. Wheat stands tall, and your sheep graze quietly on the hillside. Then one morning, the horizon darkens with dust. A column of men approaches, armored knights, archers, and behind them, a swarm of camp followers. Whether their flags show lilies of France or lions of England matters little. Both will take your grain, your livestock, and perhaps your home. When they leave, they will call it strategy. You will call it survival. You are lucky enough to have anything left. The constant presence of mercenaries worsened matters. Known as routiers or free companies, these bands of unemployed soldiers turned to raiding when kings no longer paid them. Villagers described them as worse than war itself, unpredictable, insatiable, cruel. Some demanded protection money, promising to spare a town in exchange for tribute. Others simply looted. In parts of France, peasants began to abandon their farms altogether, retreating into forests or fleeing to towns with walls. But towns could be dangerous too. A city might shut its gates against outsiders, fearing plague or spies, leaving desperate. Refugees stranded in the countryside. Markets grew unreliable. Caravans carrying wool or wine could be ambushed. Rivers clogged with tolls from petty lords desperate to refill their treasuries. Prices seesawed wildly. In one year, bread might be cheap. The next, scarcity sent it soaring beyond reach. For families who had survived the famine and the plague, this uncertainty was corrosive. A widow in the Low Countries wrote that she kept a purse for bread and a purse for fear, never knowing which she would need more on any given day. In towns, unrest simmered. Artisans and apprentices, already stretched thin by plague losses, now faced higher taxes to fund wars that brought them nothing but danger. Anger boiled into riots. In Florence, guild workers clashed with authorities. In Paris, commoners armed themselves against both soldiers and tax collectors. In London, rumors of corruption in royal finances sparked mutters that would later flare into open revolt. War was not only fought on fields between kings, it seeped into the streets and workshops of everyday people, and always there was fear. The fear of soldiers was loud, the crash of hooves, the clank of armor, the shouted demands. But there was also the quieter fear, the whisper that another plague might come, the dread of famine returning with a single ruined harvest. Mothers told their children to stay close, to avoid strangers, to pray each night for protection. Priests preached patience, though their own confidence often wavered. Chroniclers describe whole congregations weeping during sermons, convinced that they were living through the final days foretold in Scripture. Yet, amidst all this, people adapted. Villagers dug hidden pits to store grain, hoping to outlast raiders. Families hid valuables beneath floorboards. Some communities organized their own militias. Small groups of men, armed with whatever they could, muster pikes, axes, clubs to guard their streets at night. Others struck pragmatic bargains with mercenaries, treating them almost like a grim tax. Pay, and hope they leave you in peace. Daily life persisted in fragments. Bakers still kneaded dough, though their loaves were smaller. Brewers still poured ale, though sometimes watered down. Children played mock battles with sticks in the mud, too young to understand the real ones happening beyond the walls. Festivals still flickered alive on feast days, though quieter, with fewer candles and fewer voices. Life, always stubborn, found ways to continue. But the strain was cumulative. Each year of raids, each levy of taxes, each rumor of plague or famine chipped away at trust. Trust between lords and peasants, between towns and countryside, between clergy and congregation. The fabric of society, already frayed, threatened to tear. The Black Death had taught Europe that life could vanish swiftly, invisibly. Endless war taught that even survival could be hollow, and endless negotiation with hunger, fire, and fear. For the common folk, the century felt less like a series of distinct events and more like one long season of hardship, with no clear end in sight. And still, armies marched. If you're still with me, gently press 1 in the comments. Sit tells me you're here, following not just the battles of kings, but the weary footsteps of those who had no choice but to endure them. By the 1360s, war had become the background music of Europe, sometimes loud with battles and sieges, sometimes softer with uneasy truces, but never truly silent. The great powers bled each other, then paused to catch breath, only to lunge again. To live in this age was to live in the expectation that war would always return in 1360. After years of raids and devastation, England and France agreed to the Treaty of Bretigny. For a moment it seemed that exhaustion might win, where swords had not. The English crown secured large swaths of French territory, while King John II of France, still humiliated by his earlier capture, remained in English custody until his ransom could be arranged. Chroniclers wrote of hopeful markets reopening, of villages beginning to rebuild their mills and fields. The bells tolled for weddings again, not just funerals, but peace was fragile. Taxes to pay ransoms and fund armies still weighed heavily on peasants. Mercenaries, suddenly unemployed, formed free companies that turned the countryside into their hunting ground. In Burgundy and Languedoc, villagers spoke of these men as wolves, appearing at dusk to demand coin or grain, and disappearing with torches lit. Truces between kings mattered little to those caught between the roaming bands. The 1360s and 1370s saw this uneasy cycle repeat. Treaties, then breaches, then more campaigns. England's Edward, the Black Prince, led chevauchés through southern France, burning villages and seizing supplies. French forces, under new commanders, returned the favor, harassing English holdings. Each side proclaimed victories, but for the people in the fields, victory always looked like smoke on the horizon and hunger in the stomach. Even cities that escaped direct destruction felt the pressure. In Paris, the cost of bread rose sharply as grain shipments faltered. In London, wool merchants worried about the safety of shipments across the Channel, their profits swallowed by piracy or raids. In Bruges, bankers fretted over debts unpaid, as noble families collapsed under the strain. The war, though fought with swords, rippled through every ledger and market stall, and in this climate, distrust deepened. French peasants remembered how their lords had failed to protect them from mercenary raids. English laborers muttered against Parliament for passing the Statute of Laborers, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, even as workers knew their worth had risen. The social order groaned under the weight of contradictions. Those who survived famine and plague believed they deserved more. Lords who had lost heirs and wealth clung tighter to tradition. The clash was inevitable. It showed in uprisings. After the Jacquerie in France, other smaller revolts simmered, often brutally crushed, but never forgotten. In Flanders, clothworkers. In Ghent and Bruges staged strikes, demanding fairer wages and resisting taxes that drained their earnings. In England, discontent brewed quietly, waiting for its explosive moment decades later in 1381. These were tremors in the earth, hints that society itself was shifting beneath the armored feet of kings. The nobility, meanwhile, struggled to preserve its image of dominance. Tournaments resumed when truces allowed mock battles staged for prestige and pageantry. Yet the spectacle rang hollow. Everyone remembered Crécy and Poitiers, where knights fell like common men before flights of arrows. Chivalry still made for good poetry, but on the battlefield, strategy and numbers outweighed honor. A peasant's bowstring, pulled taut, could silence a noble lineage in seconds. Through it all, ordinary people adapted as best they could. In villages, communal granaries were rebuilt, sometimes hidden underground to outlast raiders. Families taught their children to scatter at the first sign of soldiers. Town councils raised militias, buying pikes and crossbows to protect gates. When royal troops could not be trusted, life bent, twisted, adjusted, but it never broke completely. By the 1370s, France, under the leadership of Charles V, began to recover lost ground. He avoided pitched battles, relying instead on harassment, fortifications, and patient strategy. England, stretched thin and drained by costs, struggled to maintain its holdings. Victories came slower, truces came quicker, and the war slipped into its long, grinding middle years. But even when banners rested, the fear lingered. Farmers sowed fields with one eye on the horizon. Merchants counted profits with ears tuned to rumors of raids. Children grew up with lullabies that carried warnings about soldiers, fire, and hunger. For them, peace was not the absence of war, but the space between devastations. The plague had shown how fragile the body was. War showed how fragile society was. Together, they carved into Europe a sense of impermanence, feeling that nothing, not health, not wealth, not even kings, could be relied upon for long. The continent braced itself, weary yet unbowed. For though plague and war had each torn at the fabric of life, another force was still tightening its grip. The climate itself, growing colder, harsher, more unpredictable, and when nature strikes, alongside famine, plague, and war, even resilience has limits. If you're still with me, leave a 1 in the comments. Sit lets me know you're following through the treaties, the raids, and the fragile illusions of peace. By the late 14th century, as if famine, plague, and war were not enough, Europe found itself at the mercy of another relentless force, the sky above. Seasons grew unpredictable, summers turned wet and cold, and winters bit harder than memory could recall. Chroniclers wrote of rivers freezing solid, of snow-bearing villages, of storms flattening crops. People began to whisper of a world growing colder, harsher, less forgiving, the beginning of what historians now call the Little Ice Age. For farmers, who made up the great majority of Europe's population, this was disaster in slow motion. Unlike the sudden shock of plague, climate worked year after year, eroding confidence with every failed harvest. In England, records show wheat yields dropping sharply in the 1370s. In Germany, vineyards withered in summers, too short to ripen grapes. In Scandinavia, fishing communities watched as ice choked their harbors for months longer than before. The consequences were immediate and personal. Bread prices rose, sometimes doubling within a season. Families who had begun to hope for stability after plague and war once again faced hunger. A peasant in Flanders might look at his children with worry as the bread loaf on the table shrank week by week. A housewife in Florence might add beans and chestnuts to stretch flour further, recalling the bitter famine recipes of her grandparents. Memory and present blended. People had lived through hunger before, and now hunger returned. Kings and lords, of course, tried to respond, but their tools were blunt. Charles V of France strengthened grain reserves in key cities, hoping to calm panic in lean years. In England, Edward III attempted to regulate the price of grain, just as his father had during the famine of 1315. Yet laws cannot summon sunshine, nor can decrees lengthen a summer. The markets moved according to weather, not parchment. The church, too, sought explanations. Preachers thundered that Europe was being chastised again for sin, too much vanity, too much greed, too much war. Processions wound through towns, banners held high, candles flickering in the chill wind. But behind the piety lay a growing unease. People wondered privately if this was punishment or simply the way of nature. After all, hadn't the plague already scoured Christendom? How much chastisement was enough? In the streets and fields, ordinary folk coped as best they could. Some migrated, leaving failing lands for towns where wages, though unstable, offered a chance of survival. Others shifted their farming less grain, more hardy crops like rye or oats. Fishermen pushed further into dangerous waters, chasing catches that might feed their villages. Adaptation was constant, though always with the fear that it would not be enough. For merchants in towns, the colder climate carried subtler ripples. River traffic slowed when waters froze. Salt fish became even more important, sustaining populations when fresh supplies dwindled. Clothiers in Flanders adjusted production, weaving heavier fabrics to meet the demand for warmth. In Italy, bankers noted increased loans to landowners struggling through bad harvests, debts that reshaped fortunes and shifted power. Even climate had an economy, and its downturn rippled outward. Children born in these years grew up in a world where scarcity was normal. Their lullabies carried warnings about thin bread and long winters. Their games imitated not only nights and battles, but also the gathering of firewood and the hiding of grain. When you grow up in an age of cold, survival itself becomes play. And once again, hardship sowed unrest. In Florence, laborers struck against high prices and low wages, leading to the Ciompi Revolt of 1378. In England, resentment over taxes and scarcity simmered, waiting for its own explosion in 1381. Across Europe, ordinary people found their patience thin. If plague had humbled them, hunger now emboldened them to demand more. The climate's grip was not just physical, it was psychological. The sense of dread that hung over fields and towns seeped into every decision. Should a young couple marry when harvests were failing? Should a family send a son to apprentice when wages were uncertain? Should a village risk planting wheat again, or turn to barley and oats? Each choice carried the weight of survival. Europe had weathered famine, plague, and war. Now the very seasons turned against it. The skies above, once a source of reassurance, sunset, the rhythm of sowing and reaping, had become unreliable. And nothing unsettles a society more deeply than the feeling that nature itself has shifted from ally to enemy. If you're still listening, press 1 in the comments. It lets me know you're here, following me into the long winters and anxious summers of a world growing colder. In the decades after the plague, Europe looked anxiously to the sky as much as to its kings. The rhythm of the seasons no longer felt dependable. Chroniclers across the continent recorded strange and unsettling weather. Summers too short to ripen grain. Rains that drowned fields, winters that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was as though the heavens themselves had grown moody and untrustworthy. The signs were everywhere. In England, the great river Thames froze so solid in certain winters that people built fires upon it. Markets sprang up on the ice, stalls selling roasted meat and warm ale. Children skated on bones, sliding across a frozen highway that should have been flowing water. What began as novelty soon revealed its menace. A frozen river meant stalled trade, shortages in the city, and hunger in the countryside. In northern Europe, particularly Scandinavia, the cold struck with greater cruelty. Fishing villages in Norway watched their harbors freeze months longer than before, stranding boats and limiting their catch. Crops shrank in yield, livestock starved when fodder ran out too early, and families migrated southward in search of more forgiving soil. Iceland, perched at the edge of survival in the best of times, lost whole farms as advancing ice swallowed pastures in the Low Countries and Germany. Vineyards failed in repeated bad years. Wine, once plentiful from the Rhine Valley, grew sour or scarce. Local economies that depended on its trade faltered, pushing merchants toward grain, wool, and other goods. But grain itself was unreliable. A single wet summer could ruin rye and barley, leaving entire regions scrambling to import food. In Lubeck, a chronicler wrote that the ships brought saltfish, but not grain, and many bellies ached with emptiness. In France, peasant families coped with ingenuity and stubbornness. They turned to hardier crops: beans, turnips, cabbages that could survive where wheat failed. Bread changed texture and taste, coarser, darker, harder to chew. A grandmother in Burgundy might tell her grandchildren about the sweet white loaves of her youth, loaves the children could scarcely imagine. Diet itself was a record of decline. For townsfolk, climate change meant rising costs and shorter tempers. Bread riots became a recurring feature of urban life. When prices soared, angry crowds gathered in marketplaces, demanding fairness from bakers and magistrates alike. Officials tried to calm them with price controls, but grain could not be summoned by decree. Some rulers, like Charles V of France, invested in larger grain reserves. Others relied on imports, tightening ties with Baltic merchants of the Hanseatic League. Still, scarcity could never be entirely prevented. Merchants, as always, adapted. In Bruges, clothworkers made heavier woolens suited to colder winters. In Florence, bankers adjusted interest rates to hedge against risky harvests. In the Baltic, trade in salted fish boomed, sustaining populations when fresh meat and dairy were scarce. The economy bent itself around the new climate, though always with strain. Psychologically, the endless winters and damp summers weighed heavily. People spoke of the world entering its last days, of nature itself rebelling. Preachers thundered that war and plague had not been warning enough, and now God turned the very sky against humanity. Pilgrimages multiplied. Relics were paraded through towns. Processions begged for mercy. Yet others whispered quietly that perhaps the heavens followed their own rhythms, indifferent to human sin. The seeds of natural explanation, planted during the plague, grew slowly in the shadow of cold. And through it all, daily life continued, stubborn as ever. Children learned to collect firewood as carefully as they learned prayers. Families built thicker walls, added hearths, and hoarded blankets. In alpine valleys, villagers dug deeper, cellars to store grain, hoping to outlast the long freezes. Some communities turned hardship into culture. Festivals on frozen rivers, songs about snowy harvests, tales told by the hearth while winds howled outside. Misery was real, but so was resilience. For the poor, however, resilience was a thin shield. The combination of failed crops, war taxes, and cold winters made survival precarious. A bad season could mean not just hunger, but death. Chroniclers note that vagabonds and beggars multiplied on the roads. Some towns barred the gates to strangers, fearing contagion or theft. Others offered alms in the hope that charity might keep peace. Compassion and cruelty lived side by side, each born of the same desperation. The cold did not end life in Europe, but it reshaped it. Food was scarcer, winters harsher, and the margin for error thinner. The Black Death had torn away half the people. The Little Ice Age now gnawed at those who remained. Famine was no longer a singular catastrophe, but a recurring visitor, stalking villages with the seasons. And yet, people kept planting, kept praying, kept enduring, for in the Middle Ages, endurance itself was the greatest victory. If you're still with me, press 1 in the comments, lets me know you're here. Walking across the frozen rivers, and through the damp fields of a colder world, the chill of the Little Ice Age did more than freeze rivers and shorten harvests. It unsettled the very fabric of society. Hunger has a way of sharpening tempers, and in the late 14th century, tempers grew short indeed. In towns, bread riots became a recurring drumbeat. When grain prices rose beyond what a craftsman's wage could afford, crowds gathered in marketplaces, their anger directed first at bakers, then at magistrates, and finally at anyone suspected of hoarding. Chroniclers in Paris recalled desperate women storming into bakeries, dragging loaves from ovens before they cooled. In London, aldermen were forced to post guards at mills to keep order. Hunger was not patient. It demanded its due in noise, and fury at the countryside, too, grew restless. Peasants who had once seen lords as protectors now muttered that castles were nothing but stone bellies, devouring their labor. Taxes, already high from war and plague, pressed harder when harvests failed. Families who had survived the pestilence now faced collectors demanding coin they simply did not have. To refuse meant confiscation. To comply meant starvation. Either way, bitterness deepened. Migration became a survival strategy. Families left barren fields in search of better land, swelling the outskirts of towns. Villages, abandoned to cold, and hunger dotted the landscape. Roofless houses, crumbling walls, churches where only owls roosted. These ghost villages became warnings etched onto the countryside. This is what happens when the land can no longer sustain you. The influx of migrants strained urban life. Guilds resisted admitting newcomers, fearing lower wages. Longtime residents grumbled that outsiders brought crime and disorder. City councils tried to regulate arrivals, demanding permits or fees, but desperate people came anyway, slipping into alleys and setting up shacks on the edges of walls. Medieval Europe was learning a lesson we still know. When food fails, people move, and walls cannot stop hunger. The cold also eroded faith in rulers. Kings who had once claimed divine favor now looked powerless against the heavens. What good was a crown if it could not summon sunshine? In France, murmurs spread that Charles V, though shrewd in war, could not command the skies. In England, Edward III's glory at Crécy and Poitiers seemed hollow when his people shivered and starved at home. Authority, already strained by plague, and war, cracked further under the weight of icy winds. Some communities turned inward, relying less on distant lords and more on local solidarity. Villages pooled resources, storing grain in communal barns, or made pacts with neighboring parishes to share livestock. Mutual aid became a quiet rebellion, a way of saying, if kings cannot protect us, we will protect each other. This spirit of local resilience hinted at the slow reshaping of European society away from unquestioned feudal obedience toward something more practical, more communal. Religious doubt, too, grew louder. The Black Death had already shaken confidence in the church. Now, with every failed harvest and frozen river, more people whispered that perhaps heaven was indifferent. Some turned to saints with fervor, carrying relics through snow-covered fields. Others drifted toward skepticism, wondering if the stars and the weather might be beyond human prayer. In university towns, scholars quietly studied Aristotle and Arabic treatises on climate and medicine, seeking natural causes where sermons offered only guilt. But life was not all gloom. People adapted with ingenuity. Dutch engineers expanded dikes and canals, holding back encroaching waters. Alpine villagers terraced slopes to catch the thin sun. In colder winters, towns invented festivals markets on frozen rivers, carnivals before Lent where fire and feasting drove away the dark. Children made games of sliding on ice, their laughter a reminder that even hardship could not silence joy. Resilience often wears the mask of play, yet beneath the laughter, discontent simmered. The Ciompi Revolt in Florence 1378, led by Wool, carters and laborers, was one such eruption. High prices, unstable work, and political exclusion drove them to storm the palaces of the elite. For a brief time, humble workers held power in one of Europe's greatest cities. Though the revolt was eventually suppressed, it revealed how brittle authority had become in a world where cold and hunger stripped away patience. Everywhere, the climate's bite was felt not only in fields and hearths, but in politics, faith, and community. The people of the 14th century had endured famine, plague, and war. Now, with the sky itself turning hostile, they found that endurance was no longer enough. They had to adapt, to resist, and sometimes to rebel, and still, the cold deepened. If you're still here, listening through these long winters and restless crowds, press 1 in the comments. It helps me know you're walking with me as the frost creeps into every corner of life. The chill of the 14th century did not pass quickly. Unlike the sharp blow of plague or the thunder of war, the climate's cold grip worked slowly, reshaping Europe year by year. It left marks not just on harvests and hearths, but on the very landscape itself. Abandoned villages, emptied first by plague and then by hunger, were quietly reclaimed by nature. Fields once golden with grain sprouted young forests. Orchards grew wild, their fruit rotting on the ground. Travelers wrote of ruined churches where ivy crept up cracked stone walls. Bells fallen silent, and wolves prowling through empty lanes. To walk through such places was to feel that human order was temporary, fragile, easily undone by a few bad seasons. In regions where people endured, farming itself began to adapt. Wheat, the pride of medieval bread, struggled in the damp and cold. Many communities turned to hardier grains, rye, barley, and oats. Rye bread became a staple in Northern Europe, dark and coarse, but reliable. Families learned to love what they once considered poor fare. In wetter regions, peas and beans took on new importance, filling pots when fields failed. The diet of Europe shifted not by choice, but by necessity. Livestock also changed. Cattle, which required large amounts of fodder, sometimes dwindled, in favor of sheep and goats, which survived better on rough pastures. Wool grew in importance, warming bodies during longer winters and fueling the cloth trade of Flanders and Florence. Even misery found ways to feed markets. Communities grew inventive. In the Low Countries, dikes and drainage canals expanded to hold back encroaching water. Farmers there became masters of coaxing crops from hostile land, a skill that would shape Dutch history for centuries. In alpine valleys, terraces carved into mountain slopes caught what little sun there was, a labor-intensive hedge against hunger. Coastal villages doubled down on fishing, smoking and salting their catches to sustain inland neighbors. Survival bred ingenuity, and ingenuity slowly bred resilience. Psychologically, however, the sense of fragility deepened. Families began to keep closer accounts of their grain stores, marking walls with charcoal lines to track how long supplies might last. Weddings were planned with harvests in mind. No celebration until the fields promised plenty. Festivals shrank in size, their processions more modest, their candles fewer. People still sought joy, but joy became practical, cautious, hedged against disappointment. Yet hardship also bound communities together in unexpected ways. In many towns, guilds expanded their role beyond work, offering support to widows, orphans, and the hungry. Confraternities organized food distributions, pooling donations in hard years. Parish records show churches doubling as granaries, storing sacks of rye to be handed out in times of want. It was not charity in the modern sense. It was survival through solidarity. Still, discontent lurked. Whenever food ran short, suspicion sharpened. Rumors spread of grain hoarders, of bakers mixing sawdust into bread, of foreign merchants driving up prices. In some places, violence followed. Crowds stormed warehouses, breaking locks and carrying away sacks. City councils learned to fear hunger more than enemy armies. A starving crowd was its own kind of weapon. The cold also shaped imagination. Art and literature filled with images of death, famine, and the turning of fortune's wheel. Woodcuts showed skeletal figures harvesting fields. Songs warned of winters that steal both bread and laughter. Even children's tales darkened. Stories of witches in the forest, of endless nights, of heroes surviving with cleverness rather than strength. Climate, like plague and war, seeped into the culture. Looking back, it is striking how much Europe endured. A modern reader might expect collapse, yet collapse never quite came. Instead, people adjusted, carrying on with lives that were smaller, leaner, but not extinguished. A woman in Cologne still spun wool by the fire, though her children wore patched cloaks. A fisherman in Brittany still set his nets, though ice cracked around his boat. A priest in Vienna still rang the church bells, though his congregation was thin and shivering. The Little Ice Age reminded Europe of its limits, but it also taught a paradoxical lesson, that people could live with less. Less food, less warmth, less certainty. Survival became a kind of quiet triumph, repeated every winter, celebrated in every spring thaw. By the end of the 14th century, Europe had been battered by famine, plague, war, and now the cold. Yet it remained standing, scarred, diminished, restless, but alive. And as the 15th century dawned, new challenges loomed, rebellions from below, schisms within the church, and the unending wars of kings. But first, the cold would tighten once. More if you're still listening. Leave a gentle one in the comments, Sid. Lets me know you've walked with me through abandoned villages, frosted fields, and the stubborn resilience of those who refused to yield to the weather. By the close of the 14th century, the cold was no longer a surprise. It had become a companion, an unwelcome guest at every table. Families who once marked years by feast, days now measured them by the length of winters, by how many loaves their grain bins could stretch, by how thin their children grew before spring. Survival had become a rhythm, a habit passed down as naturally as prayer. Malnutrition crept quietly through the population. Children grew smaller, weaker, more prone to sickness. Chroniclers note that fevers lingered longer, coughs claimed more lives, and wounds healed slowly. When plague or other illnesses returned, they found easier victims. The famine years of 1315 had left scars. The recurring chills of the Little Ice Age reopened them again and again. Life expectancy dipped, not because people could not survive accidents or wars, but because daily nourishment itself was precarious. Doctors of the time, still working within the framework of humors and astrology, struggled to explain the pervasive weakness. Some blamed corrupt air, others unlucky conjunctions of the planets. But in peasant cottages, the explanation was simpler. There was not enough food, and what there was lacked strength. Rye bread filled the stomach, but offered little richness. A thin stew of beans and turnips kept one alive, but rarely vigorous. A grandmother in Saxony might remember the sweet taste of wheat bread from her youth, but her grandchildren knew only the heavy, sour rye that clung to their teeth. Disease returned in cycles, as if riding on the back of hunger. Plague itself flared in outbreaks throughout the late 14th and early 15th centuries, never again as catastrophic as 1347, but deadly enough to remind everyone of its presence. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox also stalked the weakened. Monastic infirmaries filled with patients coughing through the night, while village graveyards quietly expanded, one cross at a time. And yet, people learned to live with this constant threat. Just as soldiers grew accustomed to war, peasants grew accustomed to hunger. Strategies for coping became part of culture. In bad years, families diluted flour with ground peas or chestnuts. They dried nettles and herbs to brew teas thought to strengthen the blood. They salted meat heavily, hoping to preserve a little protein through the lean months. These were not luxuries, but instincts, woven into memory like the stories told by the hearth. The cold also reshaped social attitudes. A kind of fatalism seeped into popular thought. Life was short, uncertain, and marked by suffering. Religious art turned darker, emphasizing judgment, the transience of wealth, the equality of death. The donks' macabre skeletal figures, leading nobles and peasants alike to the grave, spread widely. Sermons warned that earthly comfort was fleeting. Salvation lay only in the next life. The world itself, it seemed, was preaching renunciation. Yet, fatalism coexisted with defiance. Many communities found a grim pride in endurance. Festivals continued, even if smaller, with bonfires pushing back winter's dark. Guilds hosted feasts when grain allowed, as if to prove that fellowship mattered more than scarcity. Parents told children stories of ancestors who had survived the Great Famine or the Great Pestilence, teaching them that their own suffering was part of a larger human struggle. Still, discontent simmered beneath the surface. Workers in towns demanded higher wages to match the price of bread, leading to strikes and riots. In England, resentment of taxation and hardship would soon fuel the peasants' revolt of 1381. In Florence, the Ciompi wool workers had already risen in 1378, demanding recognition and fair pay. Climate did not cause these revolts directly, but it was the constant backdrop, the cold hand tightening the grip on every purse and stomach. On the land itself, the changes were visible. Forests reclaimed, abandoned farms. Wild animals grew bolder. Wolves, once rare, prowled close to villages, feeding on livestock and occasionally people. Chroniclers describe entire hunting parties called out to deal with wolf packs that had grown fat on human misfortune. Nature, it seemed, was reasserting itself, where human society had faltered by 1400. Europe had lived through nearly a century of crisis, famine, plague, endless wars, and now the cold. And yet, the people endured. They endured by lowering expectations, by tightening belts, by finding comfort in faith, in festivals, in one another. Hardship had become ordinary. To be medieval in the late Middle Ages was not to hope for comfort, but to measure survival one winter at a time. The climate's cold grip had reshaped Europe, not destroyed it, but humbled it. And in this humbled state, with bellies half full, and faith half shaken, the continent stumbled toward the next great fracture, not of body or harvest, but of belief itself. If you're still here, press 1 in the comments. Sit. Lets me know. You've walked with me through the frost, the hunger, and the stubborn endurance of those who lived in the shadow of the cold. By the dawn of the 15th century, Europe was wary. It had endured famine, plague, war, and cold. But perhaps the deepest wound was not in the body, or the land, it was in the soul. For centuries, the church had been the great anchor, the shepherd, of Christendom, the one institution that promised meaning when life seemed meaningless. Yet now, even that anchor began to crack. The troubles started earlier. In 1309, when the papacy moved from Rome to the French city of Avignon. For nearly 70 years, popes resided not in the eternal city, but in what critics called the Babylonian captivity of the church. Avignon was comfortable, wealthy, and deeply entangled with French politics. To many across Europe, it seemed less like a holy seat and more like a royal court in ecclesiastical clothing. Cardinals lived in opulence. Rumors spread of corruption and indulgence. Ordinary believers began to wonder, was the church serving God or serving itself? The Black Death had worsened the doubt. Priests had fallen in staggering numbers, leaving parishes without guidance. Survivors saw that prayers and relics had not halted the plague, and many asked what power the clergy truly held. When new priests were ordained in haste, some barely literate, many poorly trained, the gap between ideal and reality widened. Faith endured, but trust thinned. Then, in 1378, came the blow that split the church itself, the Great Schism. Rival popes were elected, one in Rome, another in Avignon, claiming to be the true successor of St. Peter. For the faithful, it was bewildering. Which pope's blessing was valid? Which mass was legitimate? If the keys to heaven could be held by two men cursing each other as frauds, what did that mean for salvation itself? Imagine being a parishioner in a small French village. Your priest insists that loyalty to the Avignon Pope is essential, but a traveler passing through insists the Roman Pope is the only true shepherd. Both men claim authority. Both threaten eternal peril for choosing wrongly. For ordinary souls, it was like being told the road to heaven split in two, and no map could show which was true. The scandal reached every corner of society. Kings and princes aligned with whichever pope suited their politics. France backed Avignon. England supported Rome. In cities like Florence, scholars debated bitterly. In taverns, peasants muttered that the church was as divided as the kingdoms. Faith, once the glue that bound Europe together, now seemed to be crumbling into factions. The corruption of wealth deepened the wounds. Avignon's papal palace gleamed with luxury. Taxes, indulgences, and fees for ecclesiastical offices flowed into its coffers. Meanwhile, in towns across Europe, widows and orphans begged for bread outside church doors. A monk in Germany wrote, "With sorrow, Peter had no silver nor gold, but his heirs are drowning in both." Such voices did not yet spark revolution, but they smolded. Yet even amid this fracture, devotion did not disappear. Pilgrimages continued. Relics still drew crowds, churches filled with prayers in every season. But faith grew restless, searching for answers beyond the official hierarchy. Mystics like Catherine of Siena and Julian of Norwich offered visions of comfort, bypassing the pomp of bishops. Catherine, in her fiery letters, urged the Pope to leave Avignon and return to Rome. Julian, in her quiet cell, wrote that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, a whisper of reassurance in a world of doubt. This mix of devotion and disillusionment created an atmosphere ripe for change. When people no longer trust the institution but cannot abandon the faith, they begin to imagine new ways of believing. By the late 14th century, reformist voices were already stirring. In England, John Wycliffe questioned papal authority and insisted that Scripture, not the Pope, was the true guide. In Bohemia, Jan Hus would soon take up the torch, preaching against corruption and calling for reform, a call that would one day ignite rebellion. But in the 14th century, for ordinary believers, the fracture felt less like reformation and more like confusion. Whose mass was valid? Whose absolution counted? Could salvation be bought, or was it already lost? When the very gatekeepers of heaven could not agree among themselves, where did that leave the flock? The crises of hunger, plague, and war had shaken bodies and fields. Now, the great schism shook the soul. If you're still with me, leave a 1. In the comments it helps me know you're following into the shadows of doubt and division, where faith itself seemed to fracture. For ordinary believers, the great schism was not an abstract quarrel among distant popes. It was a daily confusion that seeped into prayers, rituals, and even the quiet corners of conscience. The Church had been the one constant in a world of famine, plague, and war. Now even that certainty had splintered. Picture a parish in Burgundy. The priest raises the host at Mass, declaring salvation through the authority of the Avignon Pope. A merchant passing through scoffs his parish in England follows the Pope in Rome, and he insists that Avignon's priests are which blessing is true, which sin is absolved. Who holds the keys to heaven? The faithful, who once knelt with confidence, now knelt with questions. Pilgrimages became acts of anxiety as much as devotion. At shrines like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, pilgrims argued as they walked which pope's indulgences were valid. Some carried documents signed in Avignon, others from Rome, each convinced theirs was the true passport to salvation. Along the dusty roads, where prayers once united, arguments now divided. This confusion bred both cynicism and creativity. Many began to distrust official pronouncements, turning instead to local expressions of piety. Parish confraternities organized their own processions and feast days. Groups of lay people pooled resources to care for the sick and bury the dead, especially in towns where priests were scarce or suspect. In a sense, faith was returning to the people themselves, less dependent on the distant, divided hierarchy. Mysticism flourished in this vacuum. In Siena, Catherine wrote urgent letters urging the Pope to return to Rome, blending spiritual authority with political activism. In England, women like Marjorie Kemp claimed visions that gave them authority to speak publicly, something almost unthinkable a century earlier. These voices did not reject the Church, but they reshaped the experience of faith, making it more personal, more immediate, less tied to the papal court. Meanwhile, suspicion grew toward the material wealth of the clergy. In Avignon, the papal palace glittered with luxury, its banquets the stuff of gossip. Cardinals collected multiple benefices, drawing income from parishes they never visited. Ordinary believers compared this with their own hunger and grief. German chronicler acidly remarked that the shepherds feed themselves, but not the flock. The resentment did not yet explode into open revolt, but it curdled into quiet anger, the kind that festers for generations. The contradictions of the age were stark. Even as people grumbled, they still filled churches, still lit candles, still prayed for saints' intercession. A mother in Flanders whispered to St. Mary over her sick child, even as she muttered that priests quarreled like children themselves. Faith persisted, but trust in the hierarchy cracked. Some sought answers outside the Church's official teaching. John Wycliffe, in England, with his bold claim that Scripture outweighed papal decrees, drew followers who would be called the Lollards. He insisted that the Bible, translated into common tongues, was the true guide for Christians. His words spread among students and merchants, challenging centuries of tradition. In Bohemia, Jan Hus absorbed similar ideas, preaching fiery sermons against clerical corruption. Though both men would be condemned, their voices were proof that the fracture ran deep for common folk. Though the immediate concern was not theology but assurance. Could their sins be forgiven if their priests swore loyalty to the wrong pope? Could a marriage be blessed, a burial sanctified, if the officiant followed the rival pontiff? Chroniclers tell of parishioners demanding their priests declare allegiance openly, as if salvation itself depended on paperwork. The anxiety was constant, a spiritual echo of the insecurity already felt in fields and markets. At the same time, the schism revealed something profound. The church was not uncheckable. For centuries, kings had come and gone, but the papacy had stood as a single, unbroken chain. Now that chain had split, and the world had not ended. That realization, subtle, whispered, dangerous, would linger. Daily life pressed on in its stubborn way. Bakers still kneaded dough. Merchants still tallied accounts. Shepherds still tended sheep. But above every task hung a cloud of uncertainty. Were they truly in God's favor? Or had the chaos of the heavens mirrored itself in the chaos of the church? The Great Schism was not only a battle of popes, it was a crisis of trust. And once trust fractures, it rarely heals the same way again. If you're still listening, leave a gentle one in the comments. It lets me know you're here. Following the prayers, the doubts, and the pilgrimages of a world where even heaven seemed divided, the Great Schism did not unfold in a vacuum of piety. It became a battlefield of politics, with kings and princes pulling the papacy like a pawn across the chessboard of Europe. Faith and salvation might have been the language, but power was the game. France, unsurprisingly, clung to the event. Pope, to have the papacy within its borders, was a jewel in the crown, a way to bend the moral authority of Christendom toward French interests. England, locked in endless war with France, naturally threw its weight behind the Roman Pope. What began as a spiritual dispute quickly mirrored the political map of Europe. Allegiance to a pope became allegiance to a cause, and sermons echoed with the rhetoric of war as much as theology. Other kingdoms calculated more carefully. The German princes of the Holy Roman Empire, fragmented and pragmatic, weighed which pope would grant them the most privileges. Some shifted allegiance midstream, treating papal loyalty like a bargaining chip. Spain fractured along its own fault lines, with Castile leaning toward Avignon, Aragon hesitating, and Portugal watching cautiously. Each crown treated the papacy less as a spiritual father and more as a diplomatic ally. The papal courts, meanwhile, competed in spectacle. Both popes excommunicated each other, each claiming the other was the Antichrist. Both demanded tithes and taxes from the faithful, draining coin from already weary parishes. Both filled their cardinal seats with loyalists, swelling their entourages with pomp. To ordinary believers, it looked less like shepherds guiding souls, and more like rival kings, squabbling over treasure, and indeed, that is how many rulers treated them. Kings invoked papal authority when it suited their needs, granting legitimacy to wars, marriages, or claims to thrones, and ignored it when it did not. The awe that once surrounded Rome's decrees weakened when those decrees now came in duplicate, contradicting one another. The very currency of papal power, spiritual legitimacy, was being debased, not unlike the coins that rulers clipped and thinned in times of financial strain. The cynicism trickled downward. In taverns, peasants joked darkly about two popes fighting over one chair. In towns, merchants grumbled at the double taxes demanded by rival papacies. A widow in Cologne might pay indulgence fees to one pope, only to be told later that they were invalid under the other. Salvation, once a matter of faith, now looked suspiciously like a marketplace, and not an honest one. For scholars, the crisis provoked sharper questions. If the church could fracture, did that mean truth itself was fractured? If one pope could be false, how did one know any pope was true? Theologians debated furiously in universities Paris, Oxford, Prague, sending out treatises that wrestled with questions once unthinkable. Some clung to the idea of a single, visible church, wounded but not destroyed. Others suggested that authority might rest not in one man, but in councils of the faithful. These ideas would linger, setting the stage for the conciliar movement of the 15th century. But for the common folk, the debates mattered less than the erosion of trust. The church had always claimed to be above politics, a higher realm untouched by the petty rivalries of kings. Now, it seemed steeped in the same muck, playing the same games, demanding the same taxes. The holy had become ordinary, and not in a comforting way. Consider the irony. The very institution that had once mediated between warring kings was now a cause of division itself. Where once popes had crowned emperors and arbitrated disputes, now they begged kings for protection, their authority tied to royal favor. The shepherds looked like sheep, herded by the rulers they were meant to guide. This inversion did not go unnoticed. Chroniclers describe villagers muttering that the church had lost its way, that Christ's vicar now served earthly lords more than the heavenly one. The faith of the people endured. They still prayed, still sought miracles, still hoped for salvation, but their reverence for papal authority dimmed. Respect, once automatic, became conditional. It was a dangerous shift. Once people learn that authority can be questioned, they rarely forget. The Great Schism was not merely a quarrel of clerics. It was a mirror, showing Europe how fragile its institutions had become. Just as famine revealed the fragility of the land, plague the fragility of the body, and war the fragility of kingdoms, the schism revealed the fragility of faith in institutions. By the late 14th century, Europe had grown accustomed to fracture. Fractured harvests, fractured families, fractured borders, and now, fractured faith. And out of those fractures, something new was beginning to stir. If you're still listening, press 1 in the comments. It lets me know you're here. Watching crowns and popes alike lose their shine in the eyes of the people. By the late 14th century, the cracks in Christendom had widened into dangerous fissures. While popes quarreled and kings manipulated the papacy for their own ends, new voices rose from below. These voices did not come from gilded palaces or marble cathedrals, but from pulpits in universities, streets in market towns, and whispers among the laity. They were voices of reform, of anger, of longing for a purer faith, and they unsettled the guardians of orthodoxy in England. John Wycliffe emerged as a scholar who dared to say aloud what many only muttered. At Oxford, he denounced papal wealth and power, calling the Avignon papacy an empire of sin. He argued that scripture, not papal decrees, was the true foundation of the church. More radically, he urged that the Bible be translated into English, so that even the humblest plowman could hear God's word without a priest's filter. His followers, later called Lollards, spread these ideas among artisans, merchants, and even some disillusioned nobles. Hand-copied translations of scripture passed secretly from hand to hand, like contraband more dangerous than any weapon. The church condemned Wycliffe, of course, but his ideas proved stubborn. Words once released cannot easily be recaptured. For every book burned, another was copied. For every preacher silenced, another took up the message. It was the beginning of a whisper that centuries later would roar. Meanwhile, in Bohemia, another reformer carried the torch, Jan Hus, preaching in Prague. Hus denounced clerical corruption and insisted that Christ, not the Pope, was the true head of the church. His fiery sermons drew crowds who were weary of papal politics and hungry for moral clarity. Hus became not only a spiritual leader, but a symbol of national pride, especially against German and Papal influence. When he was summoned to the Council of Constance in 1415 and burned at the stake, his death only inflamed the movement. The Hussite wars that followed would tear Bohemia apart, a grim preview of how far reform could go. Beyond these great names, countless smaller movements flickered across Europe. Lay confraternities organized processions, prayers, and charitable works, bypassing official clergy. In the Rhineland, mystics like Meister Eckhart, and later his followers, sought direct union with God, suspicious of institutional mediation. Women, too, stepped into spiritual authority. The begin-seem religious women's communities outside monastic control flourished in the Low Countries, living piously without papal oversight. To the hierarchy, such independence was threatening. To ordinary people, it was inspiring. Folk, religion took on new vibrancy. Pilgrimages multiplied, sometimes less out of devotion than desperation. Relics of dubious authenticity proliferated: saints' bones, fragments of the true cross, even vials of holy blood. Skeptics scoffed, but many clung to these tokens, convinced that if popes and priests could not agree, perhaps a scrap of bone or cloth could still offer protection. The schism had taught people that the church could be divided. Reformers now taught them that it could also be challenged. Together, these lessons undermined centuries of unquestioned obedience. The laity might still kneel at the altar, but in their hearts many had begun to weigh the words of their priests more cautiously. The church responded with a mix of repression and reform. Councils were called, bulls issued, heresies condemned. The Council of Constance 1414 to 1418 ended the schism by deposing, or accepting the resignation of rival popes, and electing Martin V as a single pontiff. But while unity was restored on paper, trust was not. Wycliffe's bones were exhumed and burned. Huss was executed. Yet their ideas smoldered, like embers buried in ash, waiting for a wind. For the ordinary believer, the contradictions were exhausting. On one hand, they were told to obey the church, absolutely. On the other, they saw priests squabble, bishops enrich themselves, and rival popes hurl curses. They were told reformers were dangerous, yet reformers spoke truths that matched their own frustrations. They were told salvation depended on sacraments, yet they wondered whose sacraments were valid. Faith had not vanished, but it had grown restless, suspicious, more inward. People still prayed to saints, still lit candles, still walked barefoot in penitential processions, but beneath those acts ran an undercurrent of doubt. If famine had taught them that the land could fail, and plague had taught them that the body could fail, then the schism and reformers taught them that even the church could fail. And once that lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned. The fractured faith of the late Middle Ages was not yet Reformation, but it was a rehearsal. The stage was set, the doubts rehearsed, the anger voiced. All that remained was for history to provide the spark. If you're still here, listening as Wycliffe preaches and Huss burns, press 1 in the comments, so lets me know you're with me, as Europe's faith begins to crack under its own weight. By the early 15th century, Europe's soul carried as many scars as its body. The famine had starved, the plague had slain, the wars had burned, and the cold had chilled. But the fracture of faith left behind something more insidious: doubt. Unlike hunger or fever, doubt lingered silently in the mind, reshaping how people saw their world and their place in it. The Great Schism ended in 1417, when the Council of Constance finally restored a single pope to Rome. Bells rang, hymns swelled, and official proclamations declared unity reborn. On parchment, the wound seemed healed, but in hearts across Christendom, suspicion remained. People had seen 2, even 3 rival popes hurling curses at one another. They had witnessed the Holy Throne treated as a prize in a game of politics. Once such a sight has been seen, reverence cannot return unchanged. For ordinary believers, the legacy was confusion turned into caution. They still filled churches, still paid tithes, still lit candles, but no longer with the same blind certainty. The priest's authority felt less absolute. The Pope's decrees felt more like politics than prophecy. The Church still commanded obedience, but respect had grown conditional. Grassroots religion flourished in this atmosphere. Confraternities lay, brotherhoods and sisterhoods multiplied, organizing processions, prayers, and charitable works, without waiting for clerical permission. Pilgrimages continued, but with an edge of skepticism. Some went more for fellowship or tradition than for papal indulgences. Folk spirituality blossomed in local saints, holy wells, and village festivals, a faith that was immediate, tactile, and communal. If the papacy seemed distant and corrupt, holiness could still be found in the soil beneath one's feet. The Church, sensing its weakened prestige, attempted reform. Councils declared themselves superior to popes, hoping collective wisdom might prevent another schism. Preachers thundered against clerical excess, urging humility and purity. Some efforts bore fruit. New orders of friars renewed service to the poor, and bishops cracked down on the most scandalous abuses. Yet the deeper issue remained unresolved. People had glimpsed the fragility of the institution, and that knowledge could not be erased by decrees. Meanwhile, the ideas of reformers spread like seeds scattered by the wind. Wycliffe's Lollards in England and Huss's followers in Bohemia kept alive the notion that Scripture outweighed papal command, that the Church belonged to the people as much as to its princes. Suppressed, hunted, and sometimes burned, they, nevertheless, persisted. Their survival was proof that beneath the surface of official Christendom, another faith was stirring, a faith more suspicious of hierarchy, more eager for direct connection to the divine. The wider consequence was a culture of questioning. Just as peasants had risen against lords when taxes grew unbearable, and just as towns had rioted when bread grew scarce, so too believers began to imagine that spiritual authority might be resisted when it grew corrupt. The seed of rebellion was planted, not yet sprouted, not yet visible, but alive in the soil. At the same time, Europe's art and imagination absorbed the fracture. The Danse Macabre painted skeletons leading bishops and kings alike to their graves, mocking the pretense of earthly power. Manuscripts brimmed with images of death and judgment, not as distant abstractions but as immediate realities. Even architecture spoke. Grand cathedrals still rose, but with a severity that reflected a world grown weary, sobered by disaster and doubt, and so, by the early 15th century, Europe found itself transformed. It was still Christian, still faithful, still bound together by ritual and tradition. But it was no longer unquestioning. Famine had humbled the land, plague had humbled the body, war had humbled the kingdoms, and the schism had humbled the Church. Authority itself, whether of nature, crown, or altar, was no longer absolute. This was the true crisis of the late Middle Ages, not merely the deaths counted in chronicles, but the erosion of trust. A Europe that had once believed in stability, in order, in eternal hierarchies, now knew too well how fragile all of it was. And yet, despite everything life endured, children were born, fields were tilled, bells were rung. The story of this century is not just collapse, but survival. Not just fracture, but adaptation. People learned to live with less, to believe with doubt, to hope with scars. That resilience is as much a legacy as the suffering itself. The Middle Ages had been shaken to its core, but in that shaking lay the seeds of a new world to come. If you've stayed with me through hunger, plague, war, frost, and doubt, leave a final one in the comments. Sit tells me you've walked to the end of this long road. And maybe, Like the people of that age, you've found endurance in the telling. And so, we come to the end of this long journey through the late Middle Ages, a century when famine gnawed at the body, plague cut it down, war trampled its fields. The climate chilled its bones, and even faith itself cracked beneath the weight of doubt. It would be easy to see only despair in this story. After all, the chronicles are filled with empty villages, silent bells, burned fields, and graves dug in haste. A Europe of hunger, of death carts, of mercenaries, of rival popes. It reads almost like a rehearsal for the apocalypse. But history rarely ends with despair. What makes this period remarkable is not just how much Europe suffered, but how much it endured. For every village abandoned, another found a way to survive. For every priest lost, a community invented new rituals to carry on. For every field gone fallow, another was replanted with rye or oats. For every doubt whispered about popes and kings, a new confidence in ordinary people began to grow. The lesson, perhaps, is that resilience is quieter than catastrophe, but no less powerful. Catastrophe fills the chronicles, but resilience fills the generations that come after. Europe did not collapse. It bent, it cracked, but it endured. And in enduring, it planted seeds. Seeds of reform, seeds of social change, seeds of a new world that would one day rise from the rubble of the old dot. We, too, live with uncertainty, pandemics, climate change, wars, and institutions that do not always inspire trust. The people of the 14th century would recognize much in our headlines: empty markets, frightened families, leaders fumbling for answers, whispers of doubt in the halls of faith and politics. Their world feels distant, yet uncomfortably familiar. The difference is only in the tools, not in the questions. How do you survive when the ground itself feels unsteady? How do you hold on when the institutions meant to guide you seem fragile? How do you live, day by day, in the shadow of uncertainty? Their answer, if history teaches us, was simple, though not easy. You endure, you adapt, you carry forward what you can, and you find meaning in the smallest rituals: baking bread, ringing bells, telling stories, lighting candles. You keep going, not because certainty has returned, but because life demands it. That is, the quiet heroism of the late Middle Ages, not the battles of kings or the decrees of popes, but the stubborn resilience of ordinary people. The widow who managed a farm, the craftsman who rebuilt a burned shop, the mother who told her child stories by the hearth while winter howled outside. History remembers crowns and catastrophes, but survival was built on their hands. So perhaps the lesson is this: collapse is loud, but endurance is lasting. And when you look closely, it is the endurance that matters most. Thank you for staying with me through this long night of history. If you found comfort or fascination in the telling, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these stories alive. And if you've made it all the way here, I'd love for you to comment below, maybe just a 1. So I know you walked with me through famine, plague, war, frost, and faith, all the way to the end. History, after all, is easier to bear when carried together.